The cold came early to Blackstone Ridge that November, the kind of cold that had teeth. It wasn't the dry, still cold that settled over the plains in winter. It was a moving cold, a mean cold. It came down off the Absaroka Range in gusts that peeled the skin off your knuckles and turned every exhaled breath into something that disappeared faster than a promise. The town itself sat in a shallow valley between two ridgelines, which meant that when the wind blew wrong, it funneled right down the main street like a river looking for the sea. The storefronts shuttered. The sign above Halverson's General was missing 2 of its 4 nails and had been spinning slowly for 3 days. Nobody had bothered to fix it. Margaret Turner, Maggie, to the few people who actually spoke to her with any warmth, was on her knees in the back room of the apothecary when the cold found her that morning. She was rewrapping a child's forearm. The boy, 9 years old and freckle-faced, had caught the wrong end of a wood-splitting axe. Not the blade, the handle, swung by his older brother, who hadn't looked before he raised it. The bone wasn't broken, but the bruising ran deep purple up toward the elbow, and the boy was trying very hard not to cry. "You can cry," Maggie told him, not looking up from the bandage. "I won't think less of you. My pa says crying's for... Your pa isn't the one with a bruised arm." She tied off the wrap and sat back on her heels, studying her work. "Does that feel tight?" The boy flexed his fingers experimentally. "No, ma'am." "Good. Tell your mother to change it tomorrow morning. If it swells more or goes cold, bring him back to me." She was talking to the mother now, a thin woman named Clara Eads, who stood in the doorway with her arms folded tight across her chest, watching Maggie with an expression that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite suspicion, but landed somewhere uncomfortable between the two. "What do I owe you?" Clara asked. "Nothing today. Just don't let him chop wood again until that bruising fades." Clara pressed her lips together like she wanted to say something and decided against it. She took her son by the good arm, and they left without another word. Maggie stayed on her knees for a moment, listening to the bell above the apothecary door chime twice as it shut. Then she stood, pressed her hands against the small of her back, and stretched the ache out of her spine. She was 31 years old, and her body had stopped pretending that kneeling on cold wooden floors was comfortable sometime around 28. She wasn't a small woman. She knew that. The town of Blackstone Ridge had made absolutely certain she knew it, from the first week she'd arrived 3 years ago, fresh off a 6-day coach ride from Cheyenne with 2 medical bags and a letter of recommendation from a physician in Denver who'd called her the most capable nurse he had ever trained. That letter was folded in the bottom of her trunk now. She had stopped reading it. It didn't seem to help. The first whispers had started within a month of her arrival. She'd heard them the way you hear things in a small town, not directly, not to your face, but in the half-second pause before someone greeted you, in the way conversation shifted register when you walked into a room. Too big, clumsy, doesn't look like someone who should be touching sick people. She'd saved a miner's hand from gangrene in her second week, 3 hours of careful work that the man's own wife said the doctor in the next county would never have managed. And still the whispers found ways to diminish it. Probably just got lucky. Anyone could have done it. 3 years. Maggie had spent 3 years in Blackstone Ridge doing the work that no one else would do. The pre-dawn deliveries of babies in one-room cabins, the deep winter house calls when ice made the road nearly impassable, the slow, patient work of sitting with the elderly and the dying when their families couldn't bear it anymore. She did it without complaint, mostly, because complaining required an audience willing to listen, and she hadn't found that audience yet. What she had found, instead, was Sheriff Caleb Grayson. She was walking back from the Eads house, medical bag in hand, when she heard her name called from across the street. Not called exactly. More like announced, the way a man announces something he wants everyone nearby to hear. "Miss Turner." Grayson was standing with 2 of his deputies outside the jailhouse, and there were 4 or 5 other men clustered near the hitching post. Miners by their clothes, home from the hills for provisions. They were all looking at her. "Come over here a minute." She crossed the street. She did it slowly, not because she was reluctant, but because the mud near the center had a frozen crust that cracked unpredictably underfoot, and she wasn't interested in falling in front of an audience. Grayson was a tall man, lean in the way of men who ate enough but never sat still. With a dark mustache he kept very precisely trimmed and gray eyes that ran cold even when his mouth was smiling. He was smiling now, which meant nothing good. Mrs. Halverson says you refused to give her husband laudanum for his back pain, Grayson said. That's correct. She says you told her it wasn't medically necessary. Also correct. Maggie kept her voice level. Mr. Halverson has been using laudanum for 4 months now. He doesn't need it for pain management anymore. He needs it because he's dependent on it. Giving him more would make that worse, not better. One of the miners snorted. Grayson glanced at him, and the snort turned into a cough. Mrs. Halverson was upset, Grayson said. Mrs. Halverson can be upset. Her husband will be healthier. Grayson looked at her for a long moment, and something behind his eyes sharpened the way a blade sharpens when you draw it across a whetstone. You know, Miss Turner, I've been meaning to ask someone, anyone who'd know, what exactly your qualifications are. For this. He gestured at her medical bag. For calling yourself a nurse and treating the people of this town. I have 3 years of clinical training under Dr. Ellis Hargrove in Denver and a certificate of practice from the... You have a piece of paper, Grayson said. Not loudly, quietly, almost pleasantly. What I'm looking at is a woman who... He paused, and the pause did more damage than any word he could have chosen. Who doesn't look like she's missed many meals. Doesn't look like someone who ought to be on her feet for long. Another pause. Doesn't look like someone I'd want making decisions about my health. The miners were quiet. The whole block was quiet in that specific way that meant everyone within earshot had gone very still to make sure they caught every word. Maggie's jaw tightened once. She said nothing. I'm not saying you're a bad person, Grayson continued, with the generous air of a man handing out a very small mercy. I'm saying maybe there's a better use of your time than... Sheriff! She heard her own voice, and it was steadier than she felt. Have you ever sat beside a woman dying in childbirth and helped bring a living child into the world? Have you ever set a broken femur in a field with nothing but 2 straight boards and a strip of rawhide? Have you ever packed a gut wound and held pressure for 6 hours until the bleeding stopped, when the nearest actual physician was 2 days' ride away? He held her gaze. No. Then I'd appreciate it if you let me do my job. She turned and walked away, and she kept walking until she rounded the corner of the apothecary, and then she stopped in the alley between the building and the fence and put one hand flat against the cold wood siding and breathed. Her face was hot despite the temperature. Her hands, she noticed when she looked at them, were entirely steady. That surprised her a little. She stayed there for about a minute. Then she picked up her bag and went inside. The trapper came in around midday. She heard him before she saw him, the horse coming in at a run, which was unusual on the main street because the frozen mud made it dangerous, and men shouting, and then the unmistakable sound of someone tumbling from a saddle and hitting the ground hard. By the time Maggie got to the apothecary door, the trapper was already being hauled upright by 2 men from the street, and he was talking before he was fully on his feet, fast and ragged, the words coming out between gasps. Ronan Mercer, he was saying, grizzly. I found him 2 days ago, and I came as fast as... The cabin, up at the North Fork, past the ridge. The small crowd that had gathered in the street exchanged looks. She saw it happen. The flicker, the subtle closing of faces. Ronan Mercer. The name meant something here, and what it meant was not warm. She pushed out the door. What happened? Where is he? The trapper swung toward her voice. He was a short man, weathered past his probable age, with a beard that had ice frozen in it from the ride. Grizzly attack 3, maybe 4 days ago. He's alive, but the infection is already in it. I could smell it from across the room. The fever has him half out of his mind. He needs a doctor. The doctor isn't here, Maggie said. Dr. Pruitt left for Billings 2 weeks ago. He won't be back until spring. She had already been doing the mental math, the way she always did. Infection, fever, timeline of the injury, distance. I need to know how bad the wounds are. Where on the body? Left side. Shoulder, chest, upper arm. The bear got him good. He fought it off. I don't know how. There was blood everywhere. Is the wound still open or has it begun to close? Ma'am, I don't... The trapper looked helpless. It wasn't closed when I left. It was bad. That's why I rode here. How far is the cabin? 4 hours in good weather. But the storm coming off the range... He glanced northward, and everyone who followed his gaze saw the same thing. A low gray shelf of cloud building over the ridgeline, heavy and slow-moving, the kind that didn't bluff. It's going to hit tonight, maybe sooner. Maggie was already calculating. She turned and went back inside without another word, moving toward the storage room where she kept her emergency supplies. The surgical kit, the wound packing materials, the fever medicines, the suture thread. She started pulling things onto the work table, sorting by priority. She heard the door open behind her. "What do you think you're doing?" Grayson's voice. She didn't look up. "Packing." "To go where?" "To the North Fork." There was a silence. "To treat Ronan Mercer." "Yes." Another silence, longer this time. "You're out of your mind." "Probably." She folded a length of clean linen and pressed it flat with her palm. "Someone hand me that bottle of carbolic." Nobody moved. She reached past the space where a helpful person might have been standing and got the bottle herself. "Miss Turner." Grayson stepped fully into the room. "I'm going to be direct with you because I think you may not be thinking clearly. Ronan Mercer is not a man you go to help. That man has killed people. He ran off his own claim partner. He's been out in those mountains for years because nobody in this town will have anything to do with him, and nobody who knows him is surprised." "Is he guilty of a crime?" Maggie asked. "An actual crime, documented and charged?" Grayson paused. "Not as such." "Then he's a man who is dying." She looked up then, finally, and met his eyes. "And I'm a nurse, possibly not a very impressive-looking one, as you pointed out this morning. But this is what I do." His jaw moved. "I won't be responsible for what happens to you up there." "Nobody asked you to be." She buckled the first bag shut and started on the second. He stood there a moment longer and then he left, and she heard his voice outside, loud, carrying, clearly meant to be heard by her and everyone else. "Foolish woman. Waste of a horse. Mercer's probably already dead anyway." She kept packing. The trapper appeared in the doorway. He looked wrung out, his eyes red from the wind and probably from days of hard riding and fear. "I'll ride back with you," he said. "Show you the way." "Drink something warm first," Maggie said. "And eat. You look like you've had nothing since you found him." He blinked. He looked for a moment like someone who hadn't expected to be looked at. "Thank you, ma'am." She went around the back to the small stable where she kept her horse, a gray mare named Patience, whose name had been deeply ironic for about 2.5 years and had recently begun to seem accurate. She'd bought Patience from a cavalryman who claimed she was unmanageable. She was difficult, but not unmanageable. Mostly, she just required acknowledgement, which Maggie found reasonable. While she saddled up, she went through the list in her head again. Wound packing, suture kit, carbolic solution, fever reducers, broth material. She added a tight-wrapped parcel of dried beef and 2 hard biscuits from her own shelf. Clean linen. Splint materials in case there were broken bones she didn't know about yet. A second blanket. A lantern and oil. The list helped. It made the thing manageable, reduced it from man dying alone in a blizzard to series of specific clinical steps. She was good at the specific clinical steps. She was very good at them. She led Patience around to the front of the apothecary to secure the bags to the saddle. The trapper, his name was Hicks, she'd learned, Dermot Hicks, was coming out of the general store with a tin cup and a biscuit in hand. A small cluster of townspeople watched from the sidewalk. Not helping, just watching. One woman called out, "You'll freeze out there!" "Possibly," Maggie said pleasantly, and kept working at the buckles. "Mercer's not worth it. That man has never done a kind thing in his life." Maggie didn't answer that one. She'd learned over 3 years which arguments were worth entering and which ones would just drain her. She climbed up into the saddle. Patience shifted under her, then steadied. The northern sky was darker now, the cloud shelf lower, and she could smell it. That particular edge in the air that meant snow, and a lot of it. "Miss Turner." She looked down. The voice belonged to Amos Gill, the apothecary owner, a quiet man of around 60 who had treated her fairly from the beginning, which made him exceptional among the people of Blackstone Ridge. He was holding up a small wrapped parcel. "Extra willow bark," he said, "for the fever." She took it and pressed it into her coat pocket. "Thank you, Amos." He gave her one short nod. "Be careful." She touched her heels to Patience's sides, and they moved out of town at a steady trot, Hicks falling in beside her on his own exhausted horse. Behind her, she heard someone say something she didn't catch, and then a low laugh. She rode through it the way she rode through most things, forward, without stopping, with her eyes on what was ahead. The trail up the mountain was worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected it to be bad. The elevation gain started within the first mile, and the trail narrowed after the first two, pressing between stands of lodgepole pine that blocked what was left of the afternoon light. The ground was already frozen solid with a thin, treacherous layer of ice from a freeze 2 nights before, and Patience picked her way carefully, the horse's instincts doing the work that a less sensible animal wouldn't have managed. Maggie kept her weight balanced and let her have her head on the difficult sections. Hicks rode mostly in silence. He pointed at junctions where the trail divided, and once when they had to cross a creek, the ice at the edges cracking under the horse's weight, he went first to test it. It held. They crossed. The snow started an hour in, not dramatically, just a thin beginning, flakes small and sparse and swirling in the updrafts between the trees, the kind of beginning that doesn't look threatening yet. Maggie pulled her coat tighter and kept her eyes on the trail. "He's not what they say," Hicks said, after a long silence. His voice was rough from the cold. "You know him?" "Traded with him. 4 years, maybe 5. He was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't talk much, but he's not cruel. What happened with his partner, that wasn't what the story says. His partner was the one who—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter now." "It might matter to him," Maggie said, "when he's better." Hicks looked over at her. Something in his face shifted slightly. "You already decided he's going to be better." "I decided I'm going to do everything I can to make him better," she said. "That's different. I've lost Patience before. I know what that looks like." She paused. "I don't like to think I'm riding into that, but I'm riding in regardless." He looked at her for another moment, then turned his eyes back to the trail. "Yes, ma'am," he said, in a tone that wasn't patronizing, just acknowledging something. The snow was thicker now, the flakes bigger and wetter, beginning to accumulate on the wide, flat branches of the pines and on the backs of the horses. The light was fading faster than it should have, the cloud cover doing what it had promised. Maggie's hands inside her gloves were cold. She thought about Grayson's face, the way his voice had gone quiet and almost kind when he said, "Doesn't look like someone I'd want making decisions about my health." The particular cruelty of saying a true thing about someone, or a fact about them, which isn't the same as true, as though the fact itself was the verdict. She'd been hearing some version of that her whole life, at home, at school, in the clinical training that she'd had to fight to be accepted into at all. "You sure you can keep up?" said with a smile. Said with what looked like concern, said in the voice of someone who believed they were doing her a favor by warning her. She thought about all the people she'd helped over the years, despite and around and through those voices. Then she stopped thinking about it, because the trail made a sharp turn upward over a section of loose shale, and she needed her full attention on Patience and the ice and the darkening mountain, and thinking about Caleb Grayson was not useful here. Ronan Mercer needed her to be useful. They found the cabin as the snow was coming in earnest, the visibility cut down to maybe 30 yards in any direction, the shapes of the trees going soft and gray at the edges. It was a small structure, low-roofed, built back against a granite outcropping that sheltered it from the worst of the north wind. Well chosen, she noted, by someone who knew the mountain. A thin thread of smoke came from the chimney, barely visible against the white. He was alive enough to have kept a fire going. That was something. Hicks was off his horse before she was, moving fast toward the door. She climbed down more carefully, her legs stiff from the ride, and pulled her medical bags from the saddle. The inside of the cabin was dim and very warm. The fire was low but not out. The smell hit her first, that unmistakable rot-sweet smell of infection underneath the wood smoke and the closed-in air of a space where someone has been very ill without enough ventilation. She set her bags down just inside the door and moved toward the figure on the cot. Ronan Mercer was big. Even lying down, even diminished by injury and fever, she could see the frame of a man who was built for the wilderness. He was perhaps mid-40s, rough-bearded, his dark hair matted with sweat despite the relative warmth of the cabin. The blanket that covered him was kicked half off. His left arm and shoulder were wrapped in a cloth that had bled through and dried and bled through again. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. The fever was high, very high. His eyes opened. They were dark, and in the firelight they were glassy with fever, but not entirely absent. He looked at her the way someone looks when they're not certain what they're seeing is real. Who she? His voice came out cracked and dry. Margaret Turner, she said, from Blackstone Ridge. She was already unwrapping the shoulder, peeling the dried cloth away with careful hands, ignoring the smell. I'm a nurse. Hicks came and got me. Can you hear me? He blinked. Hicks. A pause like he was running the name through something slow. You rode up here? In this? I did. She had the wrapping off now, and she looked at the wound. 3 deep lacerations across the shoulder and upper chest, one of them dangerously close to the collarbone, all of them showing the red puffy margins of active infection. It was bad. Not unsurvivable, if she worked quickly, but it was bad. Don't try to move. Let me look at this. I'm not going to die, he said. It sounded less like reassurance and more like stubbornness, like a man arguing with someone who told him to stop. You might, she said, matter-of-factly, reaching into her bag. If I don't clean this properly in the next hour, yes, you probably will. So please stop talking and let me work. He was quiet. She lit the second lantern and got to work. Outside, the storm came down over the mountains like something that had been waiting. The snow hit the cabin roof in gusts, and the wind found the gaps in the logs and made sounds that were almost words. Maggie Turner bent over her patient in the firelight and did not look up, and did not think about the town she had left behind, and did not think about Caleb Grayson, or the cold, or the 100 miles of dark frozen wilderness between her and anything that might be called safety. She thought about the wound under her hands, and the infection, and the fever, and what came next. It was enough to think about. It was, for now, everything. The first thing she did was boil water. It sounds simple. It isn't. Not when your hands are still half numb from 4 hours on horseback in a building blizzard. Not when the fire pit needs rebuilding before the water will boil at all. Not when your patient is burning with fever and watching you from the cot, with the confused intensity of a man who can't quite decide if you're real or a hallucination brought on by 2 days of spiking temperature. Maggie got the fire up first, added wood from the stack against the interior wall. Enough of it, she noted, that Ronan had been laying in supplies before the bear found him, and got the iron pot hung over it with snow packed in to melt. Then she went back to the wound. Hicks had retreated to the far corner of the cabin near the door. He wasn't squeamish exactly, but he was in the way, and he seemed to understand that. He sat on an upturned crate and watched without speaking, which was the most useful thing he could have done. Ronan was conscious. That was both good and complicated. It meant she could monitor his responses and ask him questions, but it also meant he could feel what she was doing, and what she was doing was not comfortable. She worked by lamplight, the second lantern positioned close, cutting away the improvised bandaging that Hicks must have applied when he'd first found him. Strips of what had once been a wool shirt, well-intentioned and almost certainly what had kept him alive this long, but now fused to the edges of the wounds where the blood had dried. This is going to hurt, she told him, because she believed in telling patients the truth about what was coming. It already hurts, Ronan said. More than. He made a sound that might have been a very short, involuntary laugh. All right. She soaked the cloth in the warm water, not hot yet, but warm enough, and worked it loose in sections, stopping when she felt resistance that meant tissue rather than dried blood, waiting, re-soaking, continuing. It took 20 minutes to get the worst of it clear. By the end, his jaw was tight, and his free hand was pressed flat against the cot frame, knuckles pale, but he didn't make a sound beyond that first accidental exhale. The wounds, fully exposed, were worse than the initial inspection had suggested. 3 main lacerations. The grizzly's claws had dragged across his left shoulder in a downward arc, the deepest cut running from just below the collarbone to the outer edge of his deltoid. That one had torn muscle. It gaped in a way that meant it would need suturing tonight, in this light, in these conditions, which was not ideal. The other 2 were shallower but had already gone to infection, the skin around them hot and swollen, the wound margins showing the yellow-white that meant the body was fighting something it wasn't winning against yet. She pressed the back of her fingers to his forehead again. The fever was still climbing. When did you eat last? She asked. He thought about it. Yesterday, I think. Something. There's jerky on the shelf. That's not what I asked. She was already measuring the carbolic solution, diluting it carefully. Yesterday, something is not sufficient when your body is trying to fight infection and stay warm. Your system is burning through everything you have. I didn't have a lot of appetite, he said, with a dryness that she found, despite everything, mildly funny. I imagine not. She looked up at Hicks. Is there anything in the saddlebags? Anything edible? Hicks got up without being asked twice and went out into the storm. The door let in a blast of cold and snow when he opened it and pulled it shut hard behind him. The fire stuttered. Ronan was watching her again with those dark, fever-bright eyes. She worked carefully, cleaning the wounds with the carbolic, and tried not to think about how much she hated this particular lamplight. It was adequate, barely, and she was aware of every inadequacy in a way she wouldn't have been in a proper clinic. You came up here alone, Ronan said, with Hicks. Hicks guided you. That's not the same. He was quiet for a moment. Nobody else came. No. Because it's me. She didn't pretend not to understand what he meant. Partly that, I think. Partly the storm. Partly because there isn't a qualified doctor for 2 days in any direction. She worked on the second wound. Mostly because they didn't want to. He accepted this without apparent bitterness. It had the quality of information he already possessed. You could have not come, he said. Yes. Why did you? She had asked herself that question, somewhere on the trail, in the hour when the cold was worst, and the snow had gotten thick enough that she could barely see the trail markers. She'd arrived at an answer that was honest, if not particularly elegant. Because you were dying, and I'm a nurse, and there was no one else. She looked up briefly. That's the whole of it. I don't have a more interesting reason. He looked at her for a moment, then away. Grayson didn't come. The name landed differently inside the cabin than it had in Blackstone Ridge. Here it was just a word, not a public performance. No, he said a few things, none of them constructive. She moved to the deepest wound. Hold still. This part is going to take a while. Hum it. The suturing took an hour and a half. She had done this before, more times than she liked to count, and under conditions that ranged from merely difficult to actively dangerous. Once on a moving flatbed wagon, once in a root cellar during a rainstorm when her only light was a candle she kept having to shield with her own body. This was better than those times and worse than the conditions she would have chosen, which were a clean table, good light, and a patient who wasn't running a fever that made him intermittently confused. He drifted twice. Not all the way under. She could still rouse him with a question, but his responses slowed, his sentences unfinished, and she had to keep talking to hold him near the surface. Tell me about the bear, she said. Why? Because you're going to answer me, and that will keep you awake. Tell me about the bear. He took a slow breath. Surprised me. Coming back from the line 3 days ago. She had cubs. I could see them behind her in the trees, 2 of them. She wasn't hunting. He paused while Maggie drew the suture through, and he absorbed the sensation. Just defending. I understood that. Didn't make it easier. Did you have your rifle? Not close enough. She was on me before I could... He stopped. I had my knife. Maggie looked at the scratches on his right forearm, which she'd cleaned earlier, smaller wounds that had not been the primary concern, but which told their own story. You fought her off with a knife. I discouraged her, he said. She reconsidered. Reconsidered, Maggie repeated. She had cubs to protect. Once I wasn't between her and the way back to them, she went. There was something in that telling, the absence of bravado, the matter-of-fact quality of it, that she noted without commenting on. He wasn't narrating his own heroism. He was narrating an event that had happened and explaining the animal's logic rather than his own. It was an unusual way to tell a story, and she found herself thinking about it while her hands continued their careful work. Dermot says you trade with him, with Hicks. 4 years. He thinks well of you. A short silence. Dermot's a fair man. He rode 2 days to get help for you, in weather that was already turning. Ronan was quiet for long enough that she looked up to check his consciousness. He was awake, just thinking. I'll have to remember that, he said finally. It sounded less like a platitude than like something he was actually writing down somewhere in his mind. Hicks came back in during the second hour with her parcel of dried beef and the hard biscuits, and also, she hadn't expected this, a tin of dried oats from somewhere in the saddlebags that he said had been meant for the horses, but that he thought might serve better elsewhere. He heated water and made something that was technically porridge if you were being generous, and she got 2 spoonfuls of willow bark tea into Ronan between sutures and made him eat some of the porridge in the space between her own exhaustion and his, and that was the closest thing to a meal any of them had. By the time she tied off the last suture and sat back on the stool she'd pulled close, her lower back was screaming, and her vision had gone slightly unfocused at the edges in the way that meant she'd been concentrating too hard for too long without a break. She flexed her fingers and watched the bandaging she'd applied and counted Ronan's breaths for a full 60 seconds. Steady, fast, still, because of the fever, but steady. "Is it done?" he asked. "The suturing, yes. The rest—" She began to arrange a fresh poultice for the infected margins. "The infection doesn't care that I've been working for 2 hours. The fever is going to get worse before it gets better. You're going to need fluids and medicine through the night, and you're going to need someone to monitor your temperature." She looked at him directly. "I'm not leaving until you're out of danger. I want you to understand that." He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite classify. Not gratitude exactly. More like a man encountering something he'd stopped expecting and didn't quite know what to do with. "I heard what you said," he told her, "about why you came. The whole reason being the whole of it." "Yes. I don't think that's as small as you made it sound." She didn't answer that. She pressed the poultice in place and reached for the linen roll. Outside, the storm had achieved its full purpose. The wind was a steady roar now, and the snow against the window was so thick that there was no longer any difference between looking out and looking at a white wall. What? The night was long. Maggie dozed in the chair by the cot twice and woke herself both times. Once when the fire needed feeding, and once when Ronan's breathing changed in a way that brought her upright and alert in the space of a second. The breathing evened out. She sat with her hand at his wrist and counted his pulse and eventually determined it was the fever peaking rather than anything structural, and she got more willow bark tea into him and sat beside him while he shook. The shaking was bad. It came in waves, convulsive shivering that seemed to go all the way into his bones, his teeth clenched, his whole body rigid with the effort of fighting something invisible. She'd seen fever breaks before, and she knew what they looked like. This was the approach to that point, not the crisis itself, but it was violent enough that she kept both hands on his arm to make sure he didn't roll and tear the sutures. "Talk to me," she said, because the talking helped. Not necessarily for him, but it gave her something to anchor to in the middle of the night, in a cabin in a blizzard with a patient whose fever was high enough to be dangerous, and the nearest medical support 2 days away. "About what?" he managed, through clenched teeth. "Anything. How long have you had this cabin?" 7 years. The shaking eased fractionally. "Built it the first winter. Nearly died that winter." A pause. "Different way. How different?" "Cold. Starvation. I'd never wintered in the mountains before. I thought I had a different picture of what it would be." He exhaled slowly. "I was wrong about a lot of it." "What made you stay?" "After you realized." The shaking had quieted. His voice was still rough, but more coherent. "There wasn't—" He stopped. Started again. "In Blackstone Ridge, I had partners on a claim. We were going to run cattle up here, this side of the mountain. My partner decided the cattle weren't the point anymore once we found a good water source on the land. He wanted something else." Another pause, longer. "He told the land agent I'd forged the claim papers, got me run off the claim, and then told everyone in town I'd stolen from him." Maggie was quiet, listening. "I tried to dispute it. The land agent took his account. I didn't have—" He exhaled again. "I didn't have documentation. My word against his." He turned his head toward her slightly, and in the lamplight she could see the set of his face. Not angry, which surprised her. Just tired in the way of someone who has been tired for years. "Nobody believed me. Or the ones who might have— They believed it was possible, let's say. Not impossible. They didn't see the use in standing up for a man no one especially liked to begin with. So you came up here. Built this. Trapped. Traded with Hicks and 2 other men who didn't care enough about town politics to refuse." He was quiet. Grayson was the land agent's brother-in-law. Maggie's hand stilled for a moment. Then she continued what she was doing, adjusting the blanket over him. She filed that away. The connection between Grayson and the claim dispute, the reason the sheriff's interest in Ronan Mercer was personal rather than professional. She'd thought there was something personal in it. She'd been right. That's a long time to carry something like that, she said. You stop carrying it after a while, it's just there, part of the shape of things. She understood that in a way she didn't try to explain out loud. There were things she had stopped carrying too, or stopped trying to put down, which was different. You stop fighting the weight of them, and you just walk with it, and after a while you forget what it felt like to walk without it. The town thinks you're dangerous, she said, not accusing, just putting it on the table. I know. Are you? He considered this with more seriousness than a dismissal would have required. I can be, if there's a reason. He looked at the ceiling. I don't go looking for it. I don't enjoy it. But I'm not going to lie and say I'm a gentleman. I didn't ask you to be a gentleman, Maggie said. I asked if you were dangerous. They're not the same question. He looked at her again with that unclassifiable expression. No, he said slowly. I suppose they're not. The fever broke in this gray hour before dawn. Maggie knew it was coming. She'd been watching the pattern of it, the rhythmic climbing, and the way his skin felt under her hand, and somewhere around 4 a.m, she read something in the quality of his restlessness that made her sit forward and pay closer attention. At 4:30, he began sweating in earnest, the kind of soaking sweat that meant the body was finally throwing off the heat it had been storing, and she changed the cloth on his forehead and held his wrist and breathed. He slept after that. Real sleep, not the feverish drift of the night. Slower, deeper, the breathing regular and quiet. She sat back in the chair and looked at his face in the low firelight and let out a breath that had been waiting a long time. Hicks was asleep on his bedroll near the door, snoring softly. The storm was still going, but it had shifted, the pitch of it lower, the gusts more intermittent. It might be easing. It might just be the early morning lull. She couldn't tell yet. She got up and added wood to the fire and stood there for a moment with her hands out toward the warmth. Her back hurt. Her eyes hurt. She was hungry in the hollow, persistent way that meant she'd burned through everything she'd eaten in the last 12 hours, and her body was now politely and relentlessly requesting more. She ate the last hard biscuit standing up by the fire. When she turned back, Ronan was awake. Not fully. His eyes were half open, unfocused, but tracking her when she moved. Fever's broken, she'd said before he could ask anything. You're going to feel terrible for a while. That's normal. Your body went through a great deal in the last few days, and it needs time. He blinked slowly. You've been up all night. Most of it. You should sleep. I will, after I check the wounds. She came back to the cot and began the slow, careful business of unwrapping the outer bandaging to look at what was underneath. The swelling was down, not gone, but meaningfully reduced. The margins of the infected wounds were still angry, but the progression had stopped. She pressed gently at the edge of the deepest cut and watched his expression for signs of what she couldn't see. He winced, but didn't pull away. It's better, he said. The infection is still there. It's not worse, which is the most important thing right now. We're not out of it yet. She rewrapped it carefully. You'll need to stay still today. The sutures need to hold and your body needs the rest. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Outside the cabin, the wind gave one of its longer, low moans. None of us are. She glanced at the window, white and solid, the snow still coming down. He was right. Whether she wanted to leave or not, the storm had made that decision for her. She pulled the chair back and sat down and folded her hands in her lap and let her eyes close just for a moment. Just a moment. Miss Turner. His voice was quiet and unexpectedly careful. She opened her eyes. Thank you, he said. Just that. No elaboration, no fumbling for additional words. He said it the way someone says something they actually mean rather than something they think they're supposed to say. And then he closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Maggie sat with that for a while in the firelight, listening to the wind work itself out against the cabin walls. Outside, the world was entirely white. Inside, the fire held. It was not a comfortable night's end or a peaceful one. The pain in her back was real. The worry about his recovery was real. The awareness that she was snowed in with a man she had met 12 hours ago in the middle of a wilderness that did not care about any of them was real. None of it had the clean edges of resolution. But he was breathing. The fever had broken. The sutures were holding. For now, that was what mattered. She let her eyes close again, and this time she let herself drift. The sounds of the storm and the fire folding together into something she was too tired to interpret, just present, just sound. While somewhere in the cabin Hicks snored and the wood settled, and Ronan Mercer slept through the first genuine rest he'd had in 4 days. She slept too, eventually. Not long, but enough. When the light came through the snow-packed window a few hours later, gray, diffuse, the light of a world buried under a foot of new snow. She was the first one awake, and the fire needed feeding, and she fed it, and Ronan's temperature when she checked it had come down to something that, while still elevated, no longer made her stomach drop with dread. She allowed herself, standing in the dim cold morning of a stranger's cabin with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of weak coffee that Hicks had somehow assembled before she noticed he was awake, one quiet moment of something close to relief. Not victory. Too early for that, and she'd learned not to use that word until a patient was actually on their feet. But relief, the specific kind that comes when you've done the work you could do and the body has met you part way, when the scale tips the direction you needed it to tip, when you can look at what's in front of you and say, not today. This man is not going to die today. She drank the coffee. It was bad coffee. It was the best thing she'd tasted in days. The storm broke on the third day. It didn't do it graciously. The wind dropped first, sometime in the early afternoon, going from that sustained roar to something intermittent and then to nothing at all, and the silence it left behind was so complete that all three of them noticed it at the same moment. Hicks looked up from the harness he was mending. Ronan, propped against the cabin wall with a blanket across his lap, turned his head toward the window. Maggie, who was at the table repackaging what remained of her medical supplies, stopped what she was doing and listened to the quiet. Then the light changed, the snow-filtered gray brightening by degrees until actual pale winter sun came through the window and laid a rectangle across the floor that hadn't been there in 3 days. "It's done," Hicks said. It was done. The aftermath of a blizzard at elevation has its own particular quality. Everything buried and reshaped, the familiar landmarks of trail and tree altered or erased, the world remade in white and utterly indifferent to whatever the people in it needed it to be. Hicks went out first to check the horses, which had been sheltered under the lean-to at the side of the cabin, and had survived the storm on the provisions and each other's warmth. He came back stomping snow off his boots and reporting that the trail down was going to be slow but passable, that the horses were all right, that there was maybe 8 inches of new accumulation on the flat and drifts considerably deeper in the exposed sections. Maggie looked at Ronan. He was better, measurably, meaningfully better. But better was a relative term that covered a lot of ground between dying and recovered. His fever had stayed down since breaking the first night. The infected wounds were responding to treatment, the redness pulling back from the margins each time she changed the dressings, the smell fading. The sutures were holding. He could sit upright for an hour at a stretch without it exhausting him. And he was eating, not enthusiastically, but consistently, which was what mattered. He was sleeping naturally rather than the hectic unconsciousness of fever. And when he woke, he was coherent and present in a way he hadn't been when she'd first arrived. But he was not ready to be moved. Not down a mountain trail on horseback in the snow, not 3 days after emergency suturing of a deep muscle laceration with infection still active in 2 of the secondary wounds. She'd told him this clearly on the second morning, and he'd accepted it without argument, which told her he felt worse than he was letting on. "Hicks should go," she said. "He's been away from his own work for days, and someone should know the storm has passed, that we're all right." Hicks looked uncomfortable. "I don't love leaving you up here alone." "I'm not alone. I'm with a patient." She said it the way she meant it, clinically, practically, without the faint implication she could see him trying to avoid. "I'll be here until he can safely travel. That's probably another 5 or 6 days at minimum, depending on how the infection clears." Hicks looked at Ronan. "She's right," Ronan said. "Go. Tell Alderman at the trading post we're alive. He'll want to know." A pause. "Take the extra jerky from the top shelf." Hicks left the next morning, at first light, with the extra jerky and a note from Maggie to Amos Gill, at the apothecary listing the additional supplies she would need if anyone was able to bring them up before she and Ronan came down themselves. She watched the trail from the window until his horse disappeared around the first bend in the timber, and then she turned back to the cabin and to the quiet that was a different kind of quiet, without a third person in it. The days that followed had a rhythm she hadn't expected. She had been braced for difficulty, for the awkwardness of two strangers forced into close proximity, for a patient who resisted her instructions or resented his dependency or made the long hours of confinement unpleasant in some way. She'd had all of those experiences before. People who are sick and frightened and helpless are not always at their best, and she'd learned not to take it personally, mostly. Ronan was not that. He was not gracious in any performative way. He didn't thank her frequently or make soft conversation for the sake of filling silence. He was quiet, and the quiet was not hostile. He did what she told him in the matter of resting and eating and keeping the wounds clean without the resistance she'd half expected from a man who had clearly been entirely self-sufficient for years. When he disagreed with her about something, the timing of his first attempt at walking across the cabin, the question of whether he needed as much sleep as she was prescribing, he said so directly, and they argued it out briefly and practically, and sometimes she convinced him, and sometimes he made a point she had to concede was reasonable. He was not easy company, exactly. He wasn't trying to be, but he was honest, and in Maggie's experience, that was worth more than easy. They talked, not constantly. There were long stretches of silence that neither of them felt obligated to fill, which was its own kind of comfort. But in the mornings over coffee and in the evenings when the fire needed less tending and the light was low, they talked in the gradual, unself-conscious way of people who have already seen each other at their worst and don't have that particular vulnerability to manage anymore. She told him one evening about arriving in Blackstone Ridge, the coach, the letter from Dr. Hargrove, the first week, the way the whispers had started before she'd had a chance to do anything to earn or disprove them. He listened without interrupting, which she'd noticed was how he listened to everything, fully, without preparing his response while she was still talking. The first delivery I did there, she said, the woman's husband waited outside, and when it was over and the baby was alive and his wife was alive, he shook my hand and said thank you, and then told the blacksmith the next day that he thought I'd got lucky. She looked at the fire. 3 years of that. Why did you stay? It was the question she'd been asking herself since about month 4. Because leaving felt like letting them be right, she said, and because there were people there who needed me, even if they didn't want to admit it. He was quiet for a moment. Grayson made it worse. Grayson made it official, she said. There's a difference. The town already thought what they thought. He gave it a voice and a badge. He does that, Ronan said. There was no heat in it, just recognition. He told me about the claim, she said carefully. Your claim. His brother-in-law. Ronan looked at her. She met his eyes. You talked about me while you were working, he said. You were delirious. I needed you to keep talking to stay conscious. I asked questions. She paused. I'm not sorry I asked. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the fire. Fletcher. His name was Fletcher Crane. He and Grayson grew up together somewhere in Kansas. When Grayson got the land agent job here, Fletcher followed. He stretched his right arm slowly, carefully. I didn't know that when I went into partnership with Fletcher. I found out after. And there was no recourse. There was no recourse I could have survived using. He said it without drama. I had a rifle and a temper and not a lot else. Taking it further would have ended with me in a cell or worse. He paused. So I came up here. And Fletcher? Something moved across his face, brief and controlled. Fletcher drank himself off his own claim 2 years later, lost it to debt. He reached for the tin cup on the floor beside the cot. I heard that from Hicks. I didn't feel what I thought I'd feel when I heard it. What did you feel? He thought about it honestly. Tired. Mostly just tired. She understood that too. The exhaustion of old anger that is burned down to something that doesn't even have the energy to be satisfied by justice. Outside, the night was deep and clear. The storm gone, the stars hard and bright above the mountain. The cold pressed against the cabin walls with a steadiness that wasn't malicious, just insistent, just winter doing its job. Inside, the fire held. She was changing the dressings on the 6th morning, Ronan sitting on the edge of the cot, his shirt off, the wounds showing genuine improvement now, the deepest suture line beginning to knit properly. When she heard the horses. She heard them before she saw them because sound carried differently in the mountains after a snow. Everything gone flat and directionless. The distances compressed. Multiple horses. The specific compressed sound of horseshoes on packed snow, rather than one animal picking its way carefully. She looked up, and Ronan was already looking at the window. "More than one," he said. "Yes." Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not panic, but a sharpening, both of them recalibrating at the same speed. She went to the window and looked out at the white slope above the cabin. They came into view through the tree line 3 minutes later, 4 riders, spread across the trail in a loose formation that wasn't casual. The man in front was riding a black horse she recognized. She recognized the posture too, even at this distance, the particular erectness of a man who believes he controls whatever space he enters. Caleb Grayson. Behind him, 2 of his deputies. She recognized Aldous Webb, the younger one, and a man she knew only as Tice, who'd been deputized sometime in October. And behind them, a 4th man she didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, heavy coat, but riding with the ease of someone comfortable on horseback in rough country. She pulled back from the window. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to be. "It's Grayson," she said, "and 3 others." Ronan was already reaching for his shirt. He moved too fast, and she saw his face tighten against the pain in his shoulder. "Stop. Let me help." She crossed to him and held the shirt while he worked his arm into it, carefully, the movements limited on the left side. What would he want here? Me. No hesitation. One reason or another, he'd find one. He can't arrest you for being attacked by a grizzly. No. He was buttoning the shirt one-handed, left arm held still. But he doesn't need a real reason. He needs a story that sounds like one. He looked at her with something that was not quite worry, closer to the steady, unsurprised assessment of a man who has been expecting a certain kind of trouble for years. He'll use you. He'll say, "I kept you here, that you weren't willing." She felt something solidify in her chest. Not anger, not yet, but the precursor to it. The specific cold clarity that she recognized as the moment when she stopped being afraid of something and started being done with it. "Then I'll tell him otherwise," she said. Maggie. He said her name carefully, and it was the first time he'd used it. Not Miss Turner, just her name, said quietly. "Grayson doesn't come all the way up here in the first week after a blizzard because he wants the truth." "I know," she said, "but the truth is what I've got." She pulled her coat from the hook by the door, put it on, and went outside before the horses reached the cabin. She stood in the snow in front of the door and watched them come down the last section of trail. Grayson saw her immediately. She watched him see her, watched the slight adjustment of his posture that meant he was recalculating. He'd expected, she wasn't sure what he'd expected. Not her, standing upright in the daylight, arms at her sides, meeting his approach without backing up. He pulled his horse to a stop about 15 feet from her. "Miss Turner." His voice was doing the thing it did, the specific controlled warmth that wasn't warm. "I'm relieved to find you safe." "I am safe," she said. "I've been safe. I sent word with Hicks 6 days ago." "Yes, we received that." His eyes moved past her to the cabin door, which was closed. "We came to ensure Mercer isn't detaining you against your will." "He isn't." That's what a woman in a compromised situation might feel obligated to say. She looked at him steadily. Behind him, Webb and Tice had fanned slightly wider, and the 4th man had stopped back on the trail. Something about the 4th man's stillness bothered her. He wasn't moving like someone accompanying a welfare check. He was watching the cabin the way someone watches a thing they've come specifically to see. "I came up here voluntarily," Maggie said, "to treat an injured patient who would have died without intervention. I have remained here voluntarily because my patient is not yet well enough to be moved safely. Those are the facts." "The facts as you understand them, possibly." Grayson swung down from his horse. He was taller on the ground, and she knew he knew that. But from the town's perspective, a woman disappears into the mountains with a man of Mercer's reputation. "I didn't disappear. I told everyone I was going. You were standing there when I said it. You told me you were riding into a blizzard to help a man the town has good reason to be cautious about." He stepped closer, and his voice dropped to something that probably sounded, to the deputies behind him, like concern. "Maggie, you've been up here a week. With him. Alone." She understood exactly what he was implying, and the understanding arrived with a cold, flat fury she kept entirely off her face. "I've been up here a week performing medical care. Same as I would have done in town. Same as I've done for 6 years. For patients you were acquainted with. For whatever patient needed me. She met his eyes without flinching. Are you going to tell me my patient doesn't count because you personally dislike him? Grayson's jaw tightened. The pleasant expression didn't move, but something behind it did. The cabin door opened. She didn't look back. She heard it, the specific drag of the door over the threshold, and then the crunch of a footstep in the snow. She kept her eyes on Grayson and watched the moment he saw Ronan behind her, watched the calculation run across his face. Mercer. His voice dropped the pretense of warmth. You're under arrest. For what? Ronan's voice came from just behind and to the right of her. He'd positioned himself carefully, she realized. Close enough to be present. Not so close that he was crowding her or making it look like she needed protection. Deliberate. Detaining a woman against her will. Kidnapping. Under territorial statute. He didn't detain me, Maggie said, loud enough that the deputies could hear her clearly. I have told you that. I'm telling you again. Webb, Grayson said, ignoring her. Take him. Webb moved his horse forward, and Maggie stepped directly into the path between Webb's horse and Ronan. The horse shied slightly, and Webb pulled up, looking startled and then uncertain. Miss Turner, get out of the way, Grayson said. No. She said it without raising her voice, because raising your voice was for people who weren't sure they were right. I am this man's physician. He has active suture wounds in his shoulder and chest and an infection that is not yet resolved. If you take him on horseback down that trail today, you may be arresting a dying man, and I will testify to exactly that, in front of whatever court you choose to bring this to. Silence. The snow around them was absolute in its quiet. Webb looked at Tice. Tice looked at Grayson. She said he didn't hold her, Webb said. His voice was careful. He was younger than the others and had, Maggie had always thought, the look of someone who'd taken the deputy job believing it meant something and was still working out what it actually meant. Sheriff, if she's saying, I heard what she said. Grayson's voice was flat now. The pleasantness was entirely gone. Then why are we still talking about arresting him? Webb asked. It was not a challenge exactly. It came out more confused than defiant, but it landed the way a challenge would. Tice, behind them, said nothing, but he'd stopped moving forward. The fourth man on the trail had gone very still. Grayson looked at Maggie. She looked back at him. She was aware of Ronan behind her, not touching her, not hovering, just present, and aware of the distance between herself and Grayson, and aware, in a way that was not panic but was related to it, that she was standing in the snow outside a mountain cabin a very long way from any courthouse or witness or institution that had any power in this moment. What she had was her word, and these deputies who were, right now, watching their sheriff have trouble answering a fairly simple question. You can't prove the charge, she said quietly, just to Grayson. You know you can't, and now your deputies know it too. His jaw moved. She watched something work itself out behind his eyes. Not concession, nothing that clean. More like a man calculating new angles in real time, the original plan having hit a wall he hadn't fully anticipated. Then he reached for her arm. She didn't see it coming. The hand moved fast and closed around her forearm, not violently, but with the distinct intention of control, of moving her out of the way. She heard Webb say something sharp behind Grayson. She heard her own sharp exhale. And then Ronan was there. She felt him before she saw him move. The change in the air beside her, the shift of weight in the snow. And then he was between her and Grayson with a speed that should not have been possible from a man who 6 days ago was unable to lift his own arm. He hadn't gone for Grayson's hand. He hadn't struck anyone. He was simply there, placed between them, his body filling the space, and the look on his face was the quietest version of dangerous she had ever seen. No volume, no performance, just the absolute and unmistakable communication of a man who had drawn a line and was done discussing it. Grayson released her arm. The two men stood a foot apart in the snow, and the silence stretched long enough that it acquired weight, that specific weight of a thing that could still go several directions, and everyone present knew it. Get your hand off her again, Ronan said, and I'll put you on the ground. Doctor's orders or not. His voice was level, almost conversational. That was the worst part of it somehow. The absence of fury, the absolute steadiness of it. Grayson looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his deputies. Webb had ridden closer and was watching the scene with an expression that had moved from confused to actively uncomfortable. Tice had not moved at all. The fourth man on the trail, Maggie looked at him now, really looked, was watching with his hand near his coat but not inside it, and his face had the look of someone reassessing an arrangement they'd agreed to before they knew exactly what it was. "This isn't over," Grayson said. "No," Ronan said. "I don't expect it is." Grayson turned back to his horse. He mounted without looking at either of them again, which was a choice. He was too controlled a man for it to be anything else. Webb pulled his horse aside to give him room and kept his eyes down. Tice fell back. The fourth man turned his horse first and was already moving up the trail before the others reached him. Maggie watched them until the timber swallowed them, and she kept her breathing steady, and she waited until the sound of the hooves had fully faded before she let herself turn around. Ronan was standing where she'd last seen him, and he was holding his left arm against his side in the careful way of a man managing pain he wasn't going to mention. His face was slightly gray under the weathering. "You tore something," she said. "Probably not. Possibly. Come inside." She moved toward the door and held it for him, and he walked past her without argument, which told her he hurt more than the probably not suggested. "Sit down. Don't argue with me about sitting down." "I wasn't going to." She closed the door and for a moment stood with her hand on the latch, and her forehead almost against the wood, not quite touching it, just gathering herself back into her own edges. Her arm, where Grayson had grabbed it, felt fine. No bruise yet, though there would probably be one. That wasn't what she was gathering herself against. It was the coldness of it. The specific coldness of a man who had ridden 4 hours up a mountain in post-blizzard conditions, not because he genuinely believed she was in danger, but because she was a useful tool for a different purpose. She had known Grayson was political. She had not fully appreciated how unconcerned he was with the difference between what he said and what he meant. She turned from the door. Ronan was on the cot, his shirt already half unbuttoned, checking the sutures himself with the methodical practicality of a man who'd stopped waiting to be told things. She crossed to him, moved his hand aside, and looked. One of the deeper sutures had pulled, not torn fully, just strained, a bead of fresh blood at the margin. She cleaned it carefully and pressed a strip of clean cloth over it. "It'll hold," she said. "Good. You shouldn't have gotten up that fast." "I know." "You also shouldn't have—" She stopped. "Shouldn't have what?" She looked at him. He was watching her with those steady dark eyes, and she thought about what she was going to say. "Shouldn't have gotten involved. Shouldn't have come outside. Shouldn't have put yourself between me and him." And she thought about the moment Grayson's hand had closed on her arm, and she thought about the particular absolute quality of Ronan's stillness in the second after, the way he'd moved without theatrics, without announcement. "Nothing," she said. "Hold still." He held still. She finished with the suture and pressed the cloth in place and sat back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "He'll come back?" Ronan said. "Yes. With a better story." "Probably." She looked at her hands. "But Webb heard me. Webb and Tice both. Whatever story he builds, there are 2 men who heard me say you didn't hold me, who saw him grab my arm." She paused. "That's not nothing." Ronan looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." Outside, the mountain was very quiet. The snow lay clean and undisturbed in every direction, already smoothing over the hoofprints on the trail like the mountain was erasing what had happened. Like it didn't want the record of it. But Maggie remembered. She sat in the chair by Ronan's cot, and she remembered every word, every movement, every expression on every face, the way she always remembered the things that mattered. She had learned very young that in the absence of documents, memory was the only testimony you had. She was going to need hers. She wrote everything down that night, not because she was certain she would need it, but because she had learned over the years that the things you were certain you would remember clearly were exactly the ones that got muddied under pressure. The specific words a person used, the order events happened in, the expression on a face in a particular moment. Memory was reliable until it wasn't. And when it stopped being reliable, it did so quietly, without announcement, filling the gaps with what seemed plausible rather than what was true. So she sat at Ronan's table by the light of the lamp and wrote it all down in the small notebook she kept in her medical bag. The same notebook where she recorded patient observations, temperatures, wound measurements, medication timing. She wrote what Grayson had said, word for word as best she could reconstruct it. She wrote what she had said. She wrote what Webb had said and what Tice had not said. She wrote the description of the fourth man on the trail, his position, his clothing, the way his hand had moved toward his coat. She wrote the time of arrival and the time of departure and the direction they had ridden. Ronan watched her from the cot without comment. He was awake, which she told him he didn't need to be, and he was watching her write with an expression she had come to recognize over the past week, that quiet attention he brought to things, the quality of actually looking rather than just seeing. "You do that with your patients too," he said, when she paused to turn a page. "Write everything down." "Yes, even things that seem minor, especially those." She kept writing. "Minor things have a way of being significant later, and you can never tell which ones at the time." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a careful way to live. It's a practical way to live when nobody is inclined to take your word for things." She said it without self-pity, just matter-of-factly, the way she'd made her peace with it. Documentation is what you have when your credibility is in question. So you document. She heard him exhale slowly. Not agreement, not disagreement, more the sound of a person recognizing something they didn't have a word for. When she finished, she read back through what she'd written, checked it against her recollection for anything she'd missed or misremembered, made 2 small corrections. Then she closed the notebook and looked at the fire and thought about Grayson's face in the moment before he'd taken her arm. The calculation in it, the brief assessment of what he could do and what he thought he could get away with. The thing that bothered her most, sitting with it now in the quiet of the cabin, was not the grab itself. It was the fact that he'd done it in front of his deputies without much hesitation, which meant he was either very confident they wouldn't object, or he'd stopped caring whether they did. Neither of those possibilities was reassuring. "Who is the fourth man?" she said. Not a question exactly, more thinking aloud. What did he look like? She described him, the civilian coat, the ease on horseback, the stillness, the way his hand had moved. Ronan's face shifted in a way she'd learned to read as significant. The slight narrowing, the pause before speaking. "Sounds like it could be Harlan Soames. He's a claims assessor, works out of the territorial office in Clearwater." Maggie turned to look at him. "Why would a claims assessor ride up here with Grayson?" "Because Grayson has been trying to have this land reassessed for 2 years. He said it flatly, the way he said most things he'd already processed the anger out of. "This cabin sits on 40 acres I filed on legitimately before Fletcher came into the picture. Fletcher got the main claim, the water source, the grazing land. But this parcel, up here, this far north, he didn't want it. Too remote, too hard to develop. So it stayed mine." He shifted carefully against the wall. "Grayson's been arguing to the territorial office that my filing was invalid, that I abandoned the claim when I left Blackstone Ridge." "Did you abandon it?" "I left under duress. There's a difference under territorial statute." A pause. "Whether the statute gets applied correctly depends considerably on who's doing the applying." Maggie looked at her notebook, then back at him. "So Grayson comes up here ostensibly to check on me, and he brings a claims assessor. Who can witness what? That the cabin is unoccupied, that you're incapacitated? That I'm not maintaining the claim in any meaningful way." He met her eyes. "A man half dead from a bear attack, bedridden, being nursed by someone from town. That might look to certain eyes like abandonment." The shape of it settled into place slowly, the way things do when you've been looking at individual pieces and the whole picture finally assembles. She sat with it for a moment. "He didn't come for you," she said. "Not primarily." "No. I was useful. Arresting me would have solved 2 problems at once. But if he couldn't arrest me, the assessor being there still served a purpose. Except you walked outside. Except I walked outside." Something crossed his face that was as close to dark humor as she'd seen from him. Which probably wasn't in the plan. Maggie stood up, moved to the window, looked out at the dark. The stars were extraordinary tonight. The kind of sky you only got at elevation after a storm had scoured everything clean. She looked at them without really seeing them, running the situation through her mind the way she ran clinical problems, systematically, starting with what she knew for certain and working outward from there. We need to get to Clearwater, she said. Silence from the cot. Before Grayson does, she continued, if Soames files his assessment before we can present your side, before you can document that you've been in continuous occupation, that you left under duress, that the filing is valid. Maggie, his voice was careful. The territorial office has been receiving Grayson's version of my situation for 2 years. I'm not a man with friends in that building. No, but I am. She turned from the window. He looked at her with evident surprise, which she found faintly satisfying. Dr. Hargrove, the physician who trained me in Denver, he has a practice in Clearwater now. He knows the territorial land registrar personally. I've corresponded with him twice this year. She paused. He's also the kind of man who finds the misuse of official process genuinely offensive. It's one of the things I always liked about him. Ronan was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it. The skepticism of a man who had not had much experience with things working in his favor, trying to assess whether this was real possibility or wishful thinking. You'd write to him, he said. I'd go to him. As soon as you're well enough to travel. She held his gaze. It matters that you're there, that you can speak for yourself. A letter from me helps. You standing in that office with your documented land filing and a witness who rode with you and the testimony of 2 deputies who can confirm the sheriff's conduct, that's different. Webb and Tice aren't going to testify against their own sheriff. Webb might, she said. He was unhappy up there. I could see it. She came back to the table and sat down. And Tice said nothing. He didn't back Grayson when Webb spoke up. That's not testimony, but it's something. Ronan looked at her for a long time. She let him look. Let him work through whatever he was working through. She'd noticed, over the past week, that he was a man who needed to come to his own conclusions. That pushing him toward an answer before he was ready didn't help, just made him more resistant. She'd learned to lay the information out and step back. You've been thinking about this a while, he said finally, since last night. You were up all night thinking about my land claim. I was up part of the night, and it's not just your land claim. She folded her hands on the table. It's the same thing. It's the same mechanism. A person in a position of authority deciding that the rules apply selectively, that certain people are worth protecting and certain people aren't, based on criteria that have nothing to do with merit or truth. She looked at him steadily. I have personal experience with that mechanism. I'm not very interested in watching it operate on someone else when I might be able to do something about it. He was quiet again. Then, slowly, he nodded. Once, the way he did when he was actually convinced of something rather than just agreeing to stop discussing it. All right, he said. Clearwater. 4 more days passed before she was willing to call him fit to ride. She did not lower the bar because he was impatient, which he was. Not dramatically, not in a way he expressed as complaint, but she could see it in the restless way he sat and the increasing length of time he spent standing by the window looking at the trail. She understood it. The man had spent 7 years being entirely responsible for his own existence. Lying on a cot being managed by someone else went against something fundamental in him. But the sutures needed another 4 days minimum, and she told him so, and he accepted it, and they found ways to make the waiting useful. He started telling her about the land, not in the way of a man laying out grievances, more the way you tell someone about a place you know well, the specific details that don't come up in ordinary conversation. Where the water ran underground and surfaced again in the spring. Which sections of the 40 acres were sheltered enough for building? The timber stands, old growth in the north corner that he'd never cut, because they'd been there long enough that cutting them felt like a kind of violence. She listened and she asked questions, and she began to understand why the land mattered to him beyond the practical. Why it wasn't just property in the way that property is simply property. He'd built something up here in 7 years of solitude that had nothing to do with the claim papers and everything to do with what the solitude had cost him and what he'd made of it anyway. That understanding didn't make her softer toward him. It made her more precise in the way she thought about his situation, more specific, which was, she had found, more useful than soft. On the 3rd day of waiting, Amos Gill's son arrived with a mule and 2 saddlebags, the supplies she'd requested in her note to Hicks. The boy was 17, red-cheeked from the ride, and he stood in the doorway of the cabin looking between Maggie and Ronan with the barely concealed fascination of someone who'd been sent on an errand and arrived to find something more interesting than an errand. Pa says to tell you the whole town knows you're up here, the boy said. His name was Samuel. Says to tell you Grayson's been telling people. He stopped, glanced at Ronan, apparently uncertain about whether to continue. Go ahead, Maggie said. Says Mercer forced you to stay, that you tried to leave and he wouldn't let you. Samuel looked uncomfortable delivering this. People believe it, some of them, but Mrs. Alderman said that was foolish and told everyone who'd listen that you've got more sense than to be forced into anything. A pause. And old Prescott, the surveyor, he's been saying something about the land assessor being here, that something about that isn't right. He's worked with Soames before, and he says Soames doesn't make social calls. Maggie looked at Ronan. He was looking at Samuel with the flat patience of a man receiving information he'd already expected. Tell your father thank you, Maggie said, and thank Mrs. Alderman, and tell Mr. Prescott, she thought for a moment, tell him his instincts are correct, and I'd appreciate it if he'd write down what he knows about Soames's work practices, specifically anything about assessments that were conducted in ways that seemed irregular. Samuel blinked. You want him to write it down? In as much detail as he can remember. Yes. The boy nodded slowly, with the expression of someone who had arrived to deliver supplies and was leaving with considerably more to do. He rode back down the mountain in the afternoon, and Maggie watched him go and thought about Prescott, a dry, meticulous man in his 60s who'd surveyed half the land in the territory and was constitutionally offended by any figure that didn't add up. She'd treated his wife's arthritis for 2 years. He'd always thanked her precisely and completely, which was more than most people managed. Small things, she thought. Small things that might become something. They came down the mountain on the 10th day after Grayson's visit, on a morning that was cold but clear. The sky above the peaks a deep winter blue that hurt to look at directly. Maggie had Ronan's left arm in a sling, not because it needed immobilizing, but because the sling discouraged the unconscious movements that could strain the sutures, and the ride was going to be rough enough without adding to it. He didn't complain about the sling. He put it on when she told him to, and tied the knot himself and didn't say a word about it. The trail was better than she'd feared and worse than she'd hoped. The deep drifts in the exposed sections had frozen solid enough to bear the horse's weight, which was good. The switchbacks on the lower half of the descent were sheeted with ice underneath the snow, which was not, and they took those sections very slowly, Patience earning her name in Ronan's horse, a large, dark-colored animal he called Cutter, which told her something about him without requiring explanation, picking his way down with an experienced animal's care. They didn't talk much on the trail. The terrain required attention, but at the bottom, where the mountain track merged with the main road, Ronan pulled Cutter up for a moment and looked back at the mountain the way you look at something you're leaving. She waited without pressing him. "I've been up there 10 years, he said after a moment. Not correcting himself. He'd said 7 years when he talked about the cabin, and she'd noticed the discrepancy but didn't point it out. The first 3 before I built, just running line, trapping. He looked at the tree line. It's a different life up there. Things are clearer. When it's hard, you know why it's hard. When it goes right, you know what you did." He turned away from the mountain finally, back to the road. "Coming down into town is something I've avoided for years." "Do you want to turn back?" she asked, because it was a real question, not a challenge. He looked at her. "No." A pause. "You're not giving back your notebook." Despite everything, she smiled slightly. "No." "Then neither of us is turning back." Shem. Blackstone Ridge looked the same. Of course it did. 10 days was not enough time for a town to look different. But there was a quality to returning to a familiar place after an absence that made it look assessed, rather than simply seen. She saw the missing nails in Halverson's sign. She saw the gap between the boards above the jailhouse door that had never been properly filled. She saw the way the street was empty in the specific middle-of-the-day way that meant people were watching from windows rather than coming outside. They rode in without announcement. She hadn't written ahead to say when they were coming, partly because she didn't want Grayson to have more preparation time than necessary, and partly because she wasn't entirely sure what they were riding into, and she preferred to see it for herself before deciding. The first person who came out to meet them was Amos Gill. He walked out from the apothecary as they reached it, already looking at Ronan with the polite assessment of a man deciding whether his first impressions were being confirmed or revised. "Miss Turner," he said. Then, "Mr. Mercer." Ronan nodded once. "I've been keeping something for you," Amos said to Maggie. He went back inside and returned with an envelope. She opened it on horseback. It was a letter from Dr. Hargrove in Clearwater, written 10 days ago, which meant it had been waiting for her since before she'd even sent her own letter through Samuel. She scanned it quickly, then read it again more slowly. Hargrove had written to say that he'd been contacted by a colleague in the Territorial Land Office about an irregularity in a claims assessment filed for the Blackstone Ridge District, that a man named Soames had submitted preliminary notes on a property that showed signs of recent habitation and active occupation, but that the notes had classified the claim as abandoned. The colleague found this classification inconsistent with the observed evidence and had flagged it internally before filing it. Hargrove was writing to ask if Maggie knew anything about the situation, as the claim was associated with a man in her district. She lowered the letter and looked at Ronan. "Soames's own notes contradict his conclusion," she said. Ronan took the letter from her and read it himself slowly. She watched his face. The expression on it was difficult. Not relief, not triumph. Something more complicated than either, the expression of a man who has spent years expecting to be wronged and is encountering, unexpectedly, something different, and doesn't yet trust it. "He saw the cabin," Ronan said. "The fire, the supplies, the evidence of someone living there." He handed the letter back. He couldn't honestly write it was abandoned. But he wrote it anyway, and someone in that office noticed the inconsistency. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. "That's what we take to Clearwater. That, and your filing documents, and my account, and whatever Prescott has put together." She looked at him directly. "This is winnable, Ronan." He sat with that for a moment on horseback in the middle of Blackstone Ridge's main street, with the windows watching and the cold sitting on everything, and the two of them unwashed and road-worn, and neither of them in a condition that could have been described as dignified. "All right," he said. It was becoming, she thought, his characteristic way of accepting something he'd decided to trust. Not enthusiasm, not performance, just the quiet commitment of a man who, when he gave his word, meant it. Grayson found them before they'd been in town an hour. She'd been expecting that. He came to the apothecary where she'd taken Ronan to properly examine the sutures after the ride, and he came alone, which surprised her. She'd expected a deputy, an audience, some version of official procedure. He came alone and he knocked, which also surprised her. And when Amos let him in, he stood in the front room with his hat in his hands and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. He looked, she realized after a moment, uncertain. "I need to speak with you," he said. "You're speaking. Alone." "No?" She said it simply. "Whatever you want to say, you can say it. Amos has heard most of what's happened anyway." Grayson looked at the hat in his hands. He turned it once. She waited. "Webb came to me," he said finally. "Yesterday. He told me he wasn't comfortable with how things went up there, that he didn't think the charge was—" a pause. "Supportable. He's right. He also told me he'd write it down. What he saw. What he heard you say." Another pause. Tice said the same. Maggie felt something shift in her chest. Not surprise exactly, more the specific satisfaction of something she'd gambled on and had come through. "What are you telling me, Sheriff?" Grayson looked up at her. He was a man who had, she suspected, very rarely been in a room where he had less power than someone else, and the unfamiliarity of it showed in the careful way he was holding himself, like a man walking across ice and aware of every step. "I'm telling you I'm withdrawing the kidnapping accusation," he said. "There's no charge. Against either of you." She waited, because that was not all of it, and she knew it wasn't all of it, and she was not going to help him by filling the silence. He took a breath. "The land claim is a separate matter. That goes through the Territorial Office." "Yes," she said. "It does, and we'll be going to Clearwater to ensure it goes through correctly." She held his gaze. "I want to be direct with you about something, Sheriff. I'm going to submit my own account of the past 10 days to the Territorial Office, including the events of the day you came to the cabin, including the presence of Harlan Soames and the nature of his visit, and the timing of it relative to your accusation."
aussi d'être tombé.
She paused. If there's any conduct in that account that you'd like to have the opportunity to explain before it reaches Clearwater, you might consider doing that now. His jaw moved. Something in his face went through several iterations: anger, calculation, the particular trapped expression of a man who has been maneuvered to a position he didn't intend to arrive at. "You're not a lawyer," he said. "No, I'm a nurse who documents things carefully and has a letter from the Territorial Land Office and 2 deputies willing to write down what they saw." She tilted her head slightly. "You're right that I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think you're in a position where that distinction helps you very much." The silence that followed was the longest one she'd had with him, longer even than the ones on the mountain. She watched him work through it, watched him come to the place she'd been waiting for him to come to, the place where the calculation stopped returning useful answers. He put his hat back on. "The claim assessment will be corrected," he said. "I'll write to Soames myself." It was not an apology. She hadn't expected one and didn't need it. What she needed was the corrected assessment and the dropped charge, and she was going to get both of them, and that was sufficient. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, in the tone of a woman who is done with a conversation. He left. The door closed behind him and the bell above it chimed twice, and then there was quiet in the apothecary front room. Ronan appeared in the doorway from the back room. He'd heard all of it. She'd been aware of that. He'd stayed back, not because she'd asked him to, but because he'd understood without being told that this particular confrontation required her voice and not his. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You knew he'd come," he said. "I thought he might, once he understood what we had." She straightened the notebook on the counter, a small, unnecessary movement, just something to do with her hands. Men like Grayson don't typically fold on principle. They fold on consequences. "You built consequences." "I tried to." She looked up. "A lot of it was luck. Soames's own notes, Hargrove's colleague noticing the inconsistency, Webb having a conscience." She paused. "I can't plan for those things. I can only build what I can build and hope the rest holds up." Ronan came fully into the front room. He was moving better than he had on the mountain, the rest of the ride having done less damage than she'd feared. He stopped near the counter and looked at her with that quality of attention that she'd stopped finding disconcerting around day 4 of the storm. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think it was mostly luck." She thought about arguing with that, because arguing was frequently her instinct when someone said something she wanted to be true. She stopped herself. "We still need to go to Clearwater," she said, "to make sure the assessment is properly corrected. A promise from Grayson is better than nothing, but it's Grayson," Ronan said. "Yes." "Then we go to Clearwater." He said it the same way he'd said it on the mountain. The same quiet commitment, the same absence of dramatics. "When?" "A week. Your sutures need another week before I'm comfortable with another long ride." He nodded once, and then, because it was apparently what the moment called for and neither of them was inclined toward ceremony, they both went back to what they'd been doing. Ronan back to the examination room to finish what she'd started on the sutures, Maggie back to her notebook and her careful, necessary documentation of everything that had happened and everything that was going to happen next. Outside, Blackstone Ridge went about its afternoon. The sign above Halverson's General turned slowly in the wind, still missing its 2 nails. The street was no longer empty. People were moving on the sidewalk now, the watchers from windows having apparently decided that whatever they'd been watching for had, for the moment, resolved. Maggie wrote and didn't look up, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately calculate, like the ground under her feet was something she'd chosen to stand on rather than simply wherever she'd ended up. It was a small feeling, provisional. She didn't trust it entirely yet, but it was there, and she kept it. The ride to Clearwater took 2 days. Maggie had planned for 3, in deference to Ronan's sutures and the condition of the roads in late November, but the weather held, cold and clear, the kind of cold that was honest about itself. Not the wet, treacherous cold of the storm, but dry and still. The sky above the high country, a pale blue that went on longer than seemed reasonable. They made better time than she'd expected and arrived in Clearwater on the afternoon of the second day, both of them road-worn and stiff, and not particularly interested in conversation by the time the town's outskirts came into view. Clearwater was larger than Blackstone Ridge. A proper territorial town with a land office that had glass windows and a painted sign, a courthouse that had been built with the intention of permanence, hotels that had indoor staircases. Maggie had been here twice before, both times on medical business. She knew where Hargrove's practice was, and she led them there first, before the land office, because she'd learned that arriving anywhere with an ally already in position was better than arriving alone and hoping to find one. Dr. Ellis Hargrove was 63 years old and looked it, a lean man with white hair and the kind of permanent squint that came from 40 years of reading small print in inadequate light. He had trained Maggie in Denver when she was 24, and he was in his early 50s, and he had done so with the brisk, unsentimental thoroughness of a man who believed competence was the only relevant variable and found most other considerations a waste of time. He had written her the letter of recommendation that was folded in the bottom of her trunk, and he had meant every word of it, and if he had known the ways in which that letter had failed to help her in Blackstone Ridge, he would have been more angry about it than she was. He looked up when they came in, assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds. Maggie, travel-worn, a large man in a sling who moved like someone managing pain carefully, the general air of people who had come with something specific to accomplish, and said, "Sit down, I'll get coffee. Tell me everything in order." She told him in order. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she had always respected about him. He had the rare quality of listening as though the information actually mattered to him, rather than the quality, more common in men of his position, of listening as a courtesy while waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at Ronan with the same direct assessment he turned on everything. "The sutures," he said. "Who did them?" "She did," Ronan said. "In what conditions?" "A cabin. 1 lamp. Storm outside." Hargrove looked at Maggie. "Still holding?" "1 strained, otherwise intact. The infection cleared by day 8. She paused. "I want you to look at the shoulder before we leave Clearwater." "Obviously." He turned back to the window thinking. "Aldous Webb, he's the deputy who spoke up." "Yes. I know his uncle. He's a decent man. The uncle. I assume it runs somewhat in the family." He tapped one finger on the desk. "The colleague at the land office who flagged Soames's report. His name is Bernard Colm. He's been with the territorial office for 15 years, and he is constitutionally incapable of letting an inconsistent document pass through his desk without noting it. I've known him for 12 years. He's not a dramatic man, but he is an accurate one." "Awesome." He looked at Maggie. "You have Prescott's written account?" She pulled it from the inner pocket of her coat. 3 pages in Prescott's cramped, precise hand, detailing 4 occasions on which he had observed Harlan Soames conduct assessments in the Blackstone Ridge district, including 2 instances where Soames's final classification contradicted observable field evidence in ways Prescott had found professionally troubling. He dated each account and signed his name at the bottom with the finality of a man who understood that signatures meant something. Hargrove read it without expression. Then he set it down on the desk and looked at the ceiling briefly. "All right," he said. "We go to the land office tomorrow morning. I'll send a note to Bernard tonight so he's expecting us." He stood up. "In the meantime, you both look like you've been on a horse for 2 days, which you have. There's a hotel 2 streets over that's adequate. Get a proper meal and sleep." He looked at Ronan. "And let me look at that shoulder before you go anywhere." Ronan took off his coat and shirt without commentary. Hargrove examined the suture line with the focused attention of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and still found it worth doing carefully. He pressed at the margins, checked the range of motion, limited, Ronan's jaw going tight but his face staying still, and made 2 small sounds that weren't words before stepping back. "You did good work," he said to Maggie. It wasn't a compliment so much as a technical assessment, which was how she'd always preferred his praise. Another 2 weeks before full use of the arm. The muscle was torn, not just the surface tissue. "I know," Maggie said. "You told him that." "Several times." Hargrove glanced at Ronan. "Did you listen?" "Mostly," Ronan said. Hargrove's expression suggested this was about what he'd expected from a man with that particular face and that particular sling. "Listen better," he said, and handed Ronan his shirt. Bam! The land office the next morning was everything Maggie had prepared herself for, and several things she hadn't. Bernard Colm was a small, precise man who reminded her of a well-maintained clock. Everything about him timed and measured and reliable. His desk arranged in a way that suggested system rather than habit, every document in it occupying a known and intentional position. He greeted Hargrove with the warmth of genuine long acquaintance and looked at Maggie and Ronan with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to form opinions before he had the relevant paperwork in front of him. He had the relevant paperwork in front of him within 10 minutes. He'd pulled Ronan's original land filing, 7 years old, documentation complete, the signatures and survey notations all present and correct. He'd pulled Soames's preliminary assessment report. He'd pulled the internal flag he'd added to the file before Soames's report could be formally processed. He laid all 3 documents on the desk in a row and looked at them with the expression of someone reviewing a situation they already understood and are confirming their understanding of. "The original filing is valid," he said. "There's no question about that. The survey notation corresponds to the described parcel. The date of filing predates any counterclaim, and the filing fee was paid." He tapped Soames's report. "The assessment notes field observations consistent with an occupied and maintained property. The classification contradicts those observations." He looked up. "Can you document continuous occupation?" "I have records of trade transactions," Ronan said. He produced a folded set of papers from his coat. Hicks had prepared these back in Blackstone Ridge, a written account of 4 years of fur trades with dates and quantities, signed and witnessed by 2 other men who'd traded with Ronan during the same period. "And I have the structure itself. The cabin, the outbuildings, the equipment, the supply stores." Cullum looked at the trade records. "Dermot Hicks." He glanced at Hargrove. "I know that name." "Reliable man?" Hargrove said. "I've dealt with him twice." Cullum nodded once, set the trade records with the other documents. Then he looked at Maggie. "You were present at the property during the period the assessment was conducted." "I was." She produced her notebook. "I have dated entries from the duration of my stay, including medical observations that establish the date of my arrival, the condition of the property, and evidence of continuous habitation." She set the notebook on the desk, open to the first entry. "I also have an account of the circumstances of the assessment visit, including the personnel present and the sequence of events." She watched Cullum read. He was a man who read the way he did everything else, thoroughly, without skimming, the pages turning at measured intervals. When he finished, he closed the notebook and placed it carefully on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment in the way of someone organizing their thoughts. "The sheriff of Blackstone Ridge," he said. "He accompanied Soames." "Yes, the sheriff whose brother-in-law held the counterclaim on the adjacent property." He said it without inflection, but the absence of inflection was itself meaningful. The precision of a man who is not going to editorialize, but is going to be very clear about what the facts are. "Yes," Maggie said. Another silence. Cullum looked at the row of documents in front of him. "The classification will be corrected," he said. "The claim stands as originally filed. I'll have the formal notation completed by the end of the week and copies sent to Blackstone Ridge and to all relevant parties." He said it the same way he said everything, evenly, without drama. But Maggie felt it land differently than even she'd expected, a weight she hadn't known she was carrying shifting in her chest, making more room. Ronan said nothing. She glanced at him. His face was doing something complicated. The specific expression of a man who has been waiting 7 years for something and is now uncertain what to do with the fact that it has arrived. "Thank you," she said to Cullum, because Ronan appeared for the moment to be occupied elsewhere. Cullum nodded once. He was already straightening his documents. "But..." They walked out of the land office into the pale Clearwater morning, and Ronan stopped on the steps and stood there for a moment without moving, looking at the street in front of him. Maggie stopped beside him and waited, the way she'd learned to wait for him. 7 years, he said. Not to her specifically, just said. "I know. I'd stopped expecting that to go right." He exhaled slowly. "I'd stopped thinking about it as something that could go right. It was just there, the wrong thing that was, the permanent shape of things. It wasn't permanent," she said. "It just had a long shelf life." He looked at her sideways. Something in his expression moved, not quite a smile, but in the vicinity of one, which was approximately as far as she'd seen him get in that direction, and which she had come to find over the past 2 weeks unexpectedly affecting. "That's a strange way to put it," he said. It's accurate. They stood on the steps in the cold for another moment. Down the street, a wagon was unloading at the general store, and two women were talking outside the milliner's, and a dog was investigating something near the base of a hitching post with total commitment, and all of it had the quality of ordinary life conducting itself without any awareness that something significant had just happened inside the building behind them. Which was, Maggie thought, the way significant things usually happened, without fanfare inside ordinary-looking buildings, while dogs investigated things, and wagons unloaded, and the world declined to pause. "What do you want to do now?" she asked. He thought about it. "Eat something," he said, "and then go home." She understood both of those answers. She felt something close to the same. They went back to Blackstone Ridge by a slightly different route. Hargrove had recommended a southern road that was longer by half a day, but avoided the worst of the elevation and the ice. And they arrived in the late afternoon of the second day, coming in from the south end of town, which meant they passed the church and the schoolhouse before they reached the main street. The schoolteacher, a young woman named Ruth Ferris, who'd arrived in Blackstone Ridge 6 months ago and had treated Maggie from the beginning with the uncomplicated respect of someone too recently arrived to have absorbed the town's prior conclusions, was outside stacking wood when they rode past. She looked up, saw Maggie, and raised a hand in greeting. Maggie raised one back. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing she'd stopped expecting in Blackstone Ridge and had not yet readjusted to expecting, which made her notice it in a way she might not have a month ago. They put the horses up at the stable, and she checked Ronan's shoulder. The ride had not done the damage she'd been watching for. The sutures intact, the arm moved through its limited range without the resistance that would have indicated something wrong underneath. And they went their separate ways for the evening, she to the apothecary where Amos had kept the stove going and left her a covered dish of something that turned out to be stew, and Ronan to the boarding house where the widow alderman had a room that was nothing special but was clean and warm. She ate the stew standing at the work table, too tired to sit, reading Amos's note that accompanied it. Brief, in his characteristic way. Grayson wrote to Soames last week. Tice resigned the deputy position yesterday. Nobody seems to know why. A.G. She read it twice and set it down and finished her stew. Tice resigning made a particular kind of sense, the kind that didn't require explanation to understand. A man who had watched what happened on the mountain and said nothing, and then watched Grayson in the days after, and decided something about the situation no longer matched what he'd signed on for. She didn't know Tice well enough to say more than that, but she didn't think it was a small thing. She slept that night for 9 hours, which was more than she'd slept in a single stretch in the past month, and woke to the particular quality of winter light that meant hard frost outside and clear sky, and the kind of day that was genuinely beautiful if you could stay warm enough to appreciate it. The weeks that followed were not simple. She wanted to be honest about that. In her own mind, in the way she was constructing the story of this period for herself, because she'd noticed that people had a tendency to neaten up the after part of difficult things, to make the resolution feel cleaner than it was. The land claim was corrected on paper. Grayson remained the sheriff, because a corrected land claim and 2 deputies' written accounts of his conduct on a mountain were not, in themselves, sufficient to remove the man from a position he'd held for 4 years and intended to continue holding. He was diminished. She could see it in the way people at the general store spoke about him, the way Webb handled himself now with slightly less deference, the way Grayson himself seemed to take up less space in rooms than he used to. But he was still there, and she was still in Blackstone Ridge, and they moved around each other with the careful neutrality of people who have reached an understanding that neither of them particularly likes. She continued her work. She had always continued her work, but something had changed in the way the town related to the work. It was not dramatic. Nobody made a speech or held a gathering. It was more that the quality of the pauses before people greeted her had shortened, that the questions about her qualifications came less frequently, that when she walked into a room, conversations didn't shift the way they used to. Mrs. Halverson brought her a jar of preserves one afternoon without explanation and without reference to the laudanum dispute and without any particular warmth, but without hostility either, and Maggie took the preserves and said thank you, and that was the sum of it. Ruth Ferris started having her to dinner on Thursday evenings, practical, useful dinners where they talked about the town and the children and what each of them had observed that week, and Maggie found she looked forward to Thursdays in a way she hadn't looked forward to a regular thing in longer than she could track. The whispers didn't stop entirely. She was honest enough with herself to know they probably wouldn't, not completely. Not in her lifetime in this town. There were people in Blackstone Ridge who had made their judgments about her and would not unmake them regardless of evidence, because the judgments were not about her and had never been about her, and evidence about her was therefore not the relevant factor. She had stopped, somewhere in the mountains in a blizzard, spending energy on those people. The energy had better uses. Ronan came down from the mountain every 2 weeks, then every week as December deepened. He came for provisions and for the shoulder check she'd insisted on maintaining until she was certain the healing was complete. And then he kept coming after she'd officially discharged him from her care, which was a development neither of them addressed directly for a while, because addressing things directly required a vocabulary for what the thing was, and they were both, in their own ways, slower to name things than most people. He would come in on Tuesday afternoons, usually, and tie Cutter at the hitching post outside the apothecary, and come in and sit in the back room where she kept her desk. And they would talk for an hour or two the way they'd talked in the cabin. Not constantly, not filling silence for the sake of it, but with the ease of people who had already established that silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. He told her things about the mountain, practical things, the progress of repairs to the lean-to, the state of the trap lines, a fox he'd seen at the edge of the timber for 3 weeks running, always in the same spot. She told him things about the town. The Eads boy's arm had healed well. Prescott's wife's arthritis was responding to a new treatment she'd read about in a medical journal Hargrove had sent her. The new family that had arrived from Wyoming with 3 children and a broken wagon axle and no money and nowhere to stay. That last one she mentioned because it was a problem she was working on, and Ronan, when she mentioned it, went quiet in the specific way he did when he was thinking rather than when he had nothing to say. "How long do they need?" he asked. "Through the winter, at least. The father needs to find work in the spring. He's a carpenter. There'll be demand for that when the building season starts." "The cabin," Ronan said. She looked at him. "It's winterized. It's warm. It's not being used right now." He'd been staying in a room at the boarding house during his town visits, which had been getting longer. If they can get up the trail, the children are young. The youngest is 4. Hicks would ride with them. He knows that trail in the dark. He paused. It's not charity exactly. They'd be keeping the place up, maintaining the occupation, which matters, even with the claim corrected, evidence of continuous use. She understood what he was doing, framing it as practical rather than generous, because generosity was harder for him to offer baldly, and harder for a proud family to accept when phrased as such. She didn't point this out. "I'll speak to them," she said. The family, the Hawthorns, Nathan and Clara, and their 3 children, moved up to the mountain cabin the following week with Hicks riding escort as promised, and a mule carrying the supplies Ronan had left stocked and Maggie had supplemented. Clara Hawthorne, who was a small woman with the particular determined expression of someone who had run out of the luxury of being frightened, shook Maggie's hand before they left and said simply, "We'll take good care of it." "I know you will," Maggie said, and meant it. She watched them ride out of town toward the mountain road, the children bundled until only their eyes were visible, and stood in the cold for a moment after they'd gone, with the specific feeling of something fitting into a place it was meant to be in. Not perfectly, because nothing fit perfectly, but correctly. The conversation she and Ronan had been not quite having for 6 weeks happened, finally, in January, on a Tuesday afternoon when the snow outside the apothecary was coming down in the idle, unhurried way of snow that has no particular agenda, and Amos had gone home early, and the 2 of them were in the back room with the stove and the low lamp and the comfortable, specific quiet that had become its own kind of thing between them. She wasn't sure who started it. That was the thing about conversations that had been building for a while. By the time they actually happen, they've been happening for so long in the surrounding silence that the actual words feel less like a beginning than a middle. What she remembered afterward was that he said, "I've been thinking about the spring." And she said, "What about it?" And he said, "The Hawthorns will likely want to stay in the cabin. The man is a carpenter. He could do real work up there, build the place out. I've had plans for it for years that I never had the capacity to execute alone." "That's a practical arrangement," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. It would mean I'm not needed up there in the same way. She waited. I've been in Blackstone Ridge more than I've been on the mountain for a month, he said. That's a change.
I'd noticed. He looked at her. She looked back at him. This was, she thought, the part of the conversation that was going to require the vocabulary she'd been building slowly for the past 6 weeks. The imprecise and uncomfortable vocabulary of what something was when you didn't know what to call it, but you knew it had weight.
I'm not easy to be around, he said.
It came out direct, not self-pitying, just a fact he was putting on the table. I know that. I don't talk enough, and when I do, I'm blunt, and I've been alone long enough that I've got habits I probably don't know are habits.
I'm not easy either, she said. I argue with everything. I document things obsessively. I have very strong opinions about wound care that I will not compromise on regardless of context. She paused. I've been alone long enough that I've stopped knowing how to want things without immediately questioning whether I'm right to want them. He took that in. Are you questioning it now? She considered being evasive and decided against it, because evasion was for people who weren't sure they were right, and she had been in this particular business long enough to know herself better than that. No, she said, not right now. He nodded once. The snow came down outside the window. She said, I'm not going anywhere. He said, neither am I. And that was more or less the sum of it. Two people who had arrived at something by a route neither of them would have planned, finding that the destination, imperfect and provisional as it was the right one. Not perfect. Not without complication. Not the kind of thing that came with guarantees, but real and chosen, and held between them with both hands. Spring came late that year, as it tends to do in the mountain country. Arriving in the middle of April as a suggestion rather than a fact, the snow retreating up the slopes in grudging increments, the lower elevations turning to mud and then to brown, and then tentatively to the first pale green that meant the season had finally made its commitment. Maggie rode up the mountain in April, not alone this time, to check on the hawthorns and to see what the winter had done to the cabin and the land. Nathan Hawthorne met them at the trail's end looking, she thought, like a man who had found a place that suited him without expecting to. He'd begun repair work on the lean-to and had plans for an addition on the east side of the cabin. A second room, big enough to serve travelers coming through, he said, and Ronan listened to the plans with the specific attention of someone who has been thinking about the same thing for years and is now hearing his own ideas articulated back to him in a different voice. Clara Hawthorne had organized the interior of the cabin in ways that made practical sense and also made it look unmistakably inhabited. The small touches of a family that had put down roots, a curtain in the window, a pot of dried herbs by the door, the children's marks on the doorframe where Clara had measured their heights. Maggie stood in the cabin looking at all of this and felt, again, that sense of something fitting into a place correctly. There are 2 other families, she told Ronan on the ride back down, that I know of, who are between situations. One lost their claim to flooding last fall. One came out west with money that didn't last as long as the journey. She paused. If Nathan's addition is what he described, the cabin could shelter them through the next winter. He'll need help with the addition, timber, and time. Hicks said he'd come for a week in May, and Prescott's son is a builder. Ronan rode for a moment without speaking. She could see him working through it. The logistics, the materials, the way the land would need to be managed if the use of it expanded. He was not a sentimental man, and he didn't process things sentimentally. He processed them in terms of what was required and what was possible and what he was willing to do. It becomes something different, he said, than a cabin. Yes. It becomes a place people know they can go, if we're careful about it, if we don't overextend what it can hold. She looked at him. It doesn't have to be more than it is. But it could be. He looked at the trail ahead. The water source, he said, the one Fletcher took the claim for. That dispute is separate. The corrected filing covers my 40 acres, but not the water parcel. I know. I've been looking at the territorial statute. There's a provision. If a claim was obtained through documented misrepresentation, Prescott helped me find that same provision 2 weeks ago, she said. He looked at her. She looked back at him, not quite smiling, but close to it. You've been working on this, he said. I've been thinking about it, she said, which was her way of saying yes. He shook his head slightly, in the way of a man who is still adjusting to the fact of someone who thinks about his problems as though they are hers. Not discomfort, just adjustment. the slow recalibration of someone who has lived alone long enough that partnership requires learning in both directions, the giving and the being given to with equal difficulty, equal care. "All right," he said. The trail curved and the town came into view below them. The same storefronts, the same sign above Halverson's still missing its nails, the same streets she'd walked for 3 years, which looked the same from above and were, if she was being precise, not entirely the same as they had been. Some of that was the town. Some of it was her. The two were harder to separate than they used to be. She thought, later, much later, on an evening in May when the mountain had fully committed to spring and the air coming through the cabin's new window smelled of pine and meltwater and things beginning again, about what she would have said to herself 3 years ago if she'd had the ability to say it. She didn't think she would have said, "It gets easier," because that wasn't quite accurate. The work didn't get easier, and the people who looked at her and made their immediate calculations didn't disappear. And there were still days when the weight of being perpetually underestimated settled on her like weather, and she had to make a deliberate choice to pick it back up and keep going. That was still true. She suspected it would always be true. What she would have said was something more like, "The weight doesn't go away, but what you build around it changes. What you build alongside it changes. You stop letting the weight be the whole of the story, and you put it in proportion, and the proportion is something you have to actively maintain. It doesn't happen by itself, and there are days when it slips. But the capacity to maintain it grows if you stay in the business of doing the work. If you don't let other people's conclusions about you become your own." She would have said, "There is a difference between a place where you are tolerated and a place where you are needed, and a further difference between a place where you are needed and a place where you are valued, and the last distinction is the one worth fighting for because the other two can masquerade as the same thing for a very long time and leave you exhausted from the confusion." She would have said, "The people who show up for you in the hard moments, not the comfortable moments, not the socially advantageous moments, but the ones where showing up costs something, those are the ones. Not many. Enough." She would have said, "A man who tells you the truth when the truth is inconvenient is worth considerably more than a man who makes things pleasant, and that this principle applies in both directions, and that finding someone with whom the truth is the native language rather than a courtesy is the closest thing to luck she has ever experienced." She sat at the table by the window, Ronan's table, which had become their table, in the cabin that had begun its life as a survival structure and was becoming, slowly and imperfectly, and with a great deal of practical problem-solving, something that deserved a different name, and looked at the mountains going orange in the late light, and she thought about all of it, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has not arrived anywhere glamorous but has arrived somewhere true. The thing about the frontier, the real frontier, not the version of it that made it into songs and stories, was that it didn't reward the cleanest person or the loudest person or the most decorated person. It rewarded the person who could look at what was actually in front of them and figure out what to do next, and then do it again the next day, and the day after that, without requiring the doing to be witnessed or celebrated. It was lonely work, that kind of persistence. It was the loneliest work there was, unless you found someone who was doing the same kind of work alongside you, in their own way, for their own reasons. And then it was something else. Ronan came in from checking the horses, stomping the mud off his boots at the door the way he always did. The same sound, the same cadence, the specific small sound of a person who lives with you, and looked at her at the table and said, "You're writing again." "Thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the mountains, then back at him. "About how we got here. About whether I'd have guessed it." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and the lamplight came up between them. And outside the spring evening did the things spring evenings do in the mountain country. The last bird calls, the wind settling, the sky going from orange to a deep and serious blue. "Would you have?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, without allowing herself the comfort of a simpler answer. "No," she said. "Not this. Not exactly." She looked at him. "But I'd have hoped for it, some version of it, a place that was real." She paused. "That part I would have hoped for." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and whatever was on his face in that moment was not a simple thing. It was the face of a man who has come a long way from the version of himself that expected the worst and got it, who is still learning, imperfectly and daily, what it means to expect something different. It was not a perfect face. It was not a peaceful face exactly, but it was honest, and it was present, and it was turned toward her. Good, he said quietly. The lamp burned. The mountain held the last of its light for as long as it could, and then let it go, the way things let go of what they can't keep, the way seasons change, the way people who have been alone long enough and afraid long enough and persistent enough, those people sometimes, in the right set of improbable and unlikely and entirely unguaranteed circumstances, find the thing they didn't know they were looking for. Not the end of difficulty, not the absence of work, not a world that had rearranged itself to be fair. Just this: a table, a lamp, a window with mountains in it, and someone across from you who is not going anywhere. For Maggie Turner, who had ridden into a blizzard on faith and stubbornness, and the unglamorous conviction that the work mattered, that was enough. That was, in the end, everything.